welcome back. Have you been to a dance party? Have you been in the Wonder Room and checked that out and had some real live conversations with real live virtual people? It doesn't even make sense, does it? Anyway, I am excited to introduce to you Sarah Aiono, did I say it right? Today, because we're going to be talking about play-based learning. This is big in schools, and it's something that's so misinterpreted, misunderstood, and we want to see if we can get some clarity around how it works and what it's all about. So hi, Sarah.
Hi, it's lovely to be here and talk about my favourite topic.
Yay, that's exciting. We love favorite topics. But before we do that, I would like to know your favorite song, maybe. Which would be your theme song if you were to walk into the room and it played? What would it be?
My theme song, I was having a little think about this, and my theme song is called Stick It to the Man. And it's from the Broadway musical School of Rock. And it is a fantastic song, and it actually is probably our theme song for our family. We were fortunate enough to see this on Broadway as a family, as intrepid world schoolers. And it really does just kind of, I suppose, summarize how we feel about, following a system, following rules, being ordinary, doing things because everyone says you should. We quite like Stick It to the Man. So anyone that wants to listen to that, pop it on, and I dare you not to feel inspired by that song.
I love it. I dare you not to feel inspired. I love that. I love the sentiments as well. So thank you. That's the entrepreneurial mindset, right?
Absolutely.
It's like we just play by our own rules. Walk to the beat of our own drum.
And don't do what everyone else says you have to do.
Yeah. Follow your heart. I think that's the key message there as well. So Sarah, let's talk about play. Why is this such an important pedagogical approach in this 21st century?
I think there are a number of reasons why, and I think I'll probably start with what seems the most obvious and why we should be having children play for as long as possible in their lives. If ever stopping, as adults, we shouldn't ever stop playing either. But really, I think the pandemic is a highlight of this. We were thrown a bit of a curveball, the world. Suddenly life as we knew it needed to change. And for many people, that promoted the idea of being resilient, being flexible, being creative thinkers. We saw some amazing creativity from people who were locked up at home. We saw thinking in different ways. We've seen businesses that have had to pivot significantly from their business as usual approach. Resiliency for many people in times of adversity. All of those skills, those, I suppose we know them as soft skills, and I don't know why, because to me they're pretty hard skills, right? They make you tough. Those are all brought about by our early experiences as players. The more we have an opportunity to play as young children and through into middle childhood, the more we get an opportunity to practice those skills in a safe place, where the consequences aren't as perhaps significant as they are when we reach adult life. So, when we're involved in play and we have, conflict with a person that wants to play with us, we get to practice conflict resolution in a safe place, right? Often with support from people who know how to resolve conflict and can scaffold that for us. So all of those executive function skills are in there, soft skills, and so on. I think what's lessened and is growing in awareness is a link to formal academic learning and some of those learning areas that we see in curriculums around the world. So let's take literacy and maths, for example. We know when children are playing that, particularly as they mature, they don't shut up. Noise is a problem in play for many teachers, and that's a good thing because kids are talking. And when they're talking, they're having to listen to each other. So oral language development is huge in play. We know that for children who come from homes where oral language isn't supported as much, where the language levels are low or children come in developmentally behind in language, play enables that sort of first language learning condition to be able to practice those new words. The same with children who come from second language backgrounds, moving into a different context, usually English as a second language at school, being able to practice English in a meaningful way, learning the language that's important to them in the context of what they're trying to do. Mathematics, You know, we often talk about, here in New Zealand, we have strand maths and we have number. Strand maths are things like measurement, geometry, and so on. And, you know, when you see children playing with things, the amount of measuring, estimating, capacity, shape knowledge, spatial awareness, you know, those mathematical concepts are just naturally explored in play. The other thing, though, that I think probably is the most, well, it's the last to come on in terms of knowledge around play is science, right? When you have children who are engaged in play outdoors in particular, with the natural world and with large loose parts, large big things to play with, children naturally explore the laws of physics. They involved in mixing and creating and making, which is early chemistry. They're exploring the natural world and learning about it and hypothesizing and inquiring about the world around them, which is all that sort of nature of science, living world, physical world, and so on. So we see a lot of play and related to early science when we see play coming through. So why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't children play with, you know, with their learning? I think is probably the best question, because the research certainly significantly supports it.
That's wonderful. It occurs to me though, and I'm wondering, where does the link happen? Because now they're playing it in science and they're working out levers and physics and all that stuff, but where does the actual link happen between that and the academic things they need to know?
Yeah, and this points to the really crucial role that the adult has. And I think that there is a misinterpretation and a misunderstanding about the role an adult has in children's learning. We hear a lot of rhetoric around, you know, don't interrupt, don't interfere with kids, let them discover it for themselves. And to a point, that's true, because we want children to be independent in their inquiry. We want them to lead what they're interested in and inquire. They won't learn to be naturally inquisitive if they don't get that opportunity and someone's telling them what they have to learn all the time. But equally, it's not a hands-off, because children don't know what they don't know. And so we have to be able to help them make those connections. And I think I'm a bit of this is a really geeky admission here, but I'm a fangirl of Vygotsky. And this is very much where Vygotsky's theory is so important, and his later students like Brunner and so on and so forth, you know, scaffolding and things. Vygotsky's zone of proximal development should be the sort of the red alarm for teachers around where they sit and play. And that's not to say that they're the person that needs to have all the information, but when children move into that zone of proximal development, when they've naturally inquired about something and are reaching a point where it's getting difficult, or there's a challenge and it's just getting that hard, that's the point where the teacher's most useful, either to be that more knowledgeable other that Vygotsky talks about and help them by asking, you know, relevant questions to model thinking, or to point out something that maybe they haven't seen, or to model a new skill, or they're the person that might know of the most appropriate, more knowledgeable other, which might be another child in the classroom who can be the expert. And the teacher sort of becomes the conduit who says, well, you know, I can see what you're trying to do here. And Jack over there, I saw him doing this last week. He's really good at this. Let's go and see if he's got any answers to this, and maybe he can help you solve the problem. So that's another role that the teacher has. The role of a teacher in play is hugely complex. It can't be simplified. There's so many different things that a teacher does, but ultimately, as a teacher, if you're using play as a pedagogical tool, you are the one responsible for helping that child make the connection between what they're naturally interested in and the curriculum, and understanding the learning that's going on.
So it is not, which is what I see, and I know that you probably see in some schools, teachers with their cup of coffee, letting children go off and play.
Well, in saying that, if that teacher is having a cup of coffee, but observing the play and making a note and thinking, oh, I can see they're doing that, I'm going to bring this in tomorrow, and I remember where there's a book that I can show them after morning tea. Fine, have the cup of coffee and do it all in your head. But the research is really clear that a teacher needs to teach with intention. And this is no different whether a child is leading the learning or it's teacher directed. What we're doing though, if a child is leading their learning through play, as the intentional teacher, we are observing and we are gathering our assessment data, our observation data, to think about how we can best support that play further, how we can respond. So we take a notice, recognise, respond approach. And one of the challenges...
Say that again. Notice, recognise, and respond.
Yeah, recognise, respond. There's a few other ones in there, but those are the three that we lead with teachers. Notice the play first. Notice what's going on. Don't be too busy to not be in the play, right? Because we also see teachers who use play as a babysitter for kids while they get on with the real learning, right? The real teaching, the important stuff. So we have to be able to be in the play, to notice the play that's going on. We have to recognise the learning. And that's another challenge for teachers. We have to really know our curriculum. We have to know what we're looking at. And this is a challenge when we're so used to pre-planning for things. When we actually start to look at play and have to suddenly see science, the arts, technology, maths, and dance all in the same environment and know what to do next, that's a big chat. We're not trained to do that as primary teachers. So it takes a little bit of practice to do that. And then respond. Do we respond by resourcing for the play a little bit more? We can see that some children are trying to do something, but we know there's something in the back room we could go and get for them to put in and it will help them. Do we do something a little bit more deliberate after morning tea, sit them down, show them a book, show them a video that's related to what they're doing, or have a class discussion? Do we intervene in the moment and ask strategic questions and make comments and give feedback? Or one of our responses can equally be to choose not to be in the play and watch and see how it unfolds. And that really comes down to knowing the children and thinking, well, if I step in now, I'm actually going to influence this play in a way that it shouldn't happen. So I'm going to step out and watch and see. So we have to kind of, I say to teachers, it's like having this big toolbox and watching and diagnosing the problem and then pulling out the tool that's right for that job. And some tools are tools you use all the time, and some are specialist tools that you use in a very considered way.
I like that analogy, because you do need that bank of, and that kite, as we'd say in New Zealand, of strategies that you can then go to at that moment, and that takes experience as well. So, and of course practice. So what are some of those practical skills and techniques does a teacher need to be able to implement a play-based philosophy?
I think first of all, teachers need to be adventurous. They need to be reflective and flexible. I think probably the first three skills, because if you are a teacher who has traditionally followed quite a planned approach in your classroom, almost formulaic, this is how we're all trained, this is how we teach, to move away and start to trust children to lead their learning can be really scary, right? It's unknown territory, and we often work with teachers and say, look, just be brave, just start small and just try it a little bit, and you'll be pleasantly surprised as to how the children respond to this. It won't all fall over. And then I think really as practice starts to unfold, probably the most useful skill is to be creative, to get involved in the magic of play and to think creatively and to have a really broad knowledge of the world, because your role is to connect what children are doing in their play to the world and help them see the relevance of what they're doing, which means that, if you've got kids in front of you who are really into diggers and bulldozing and excavation, and that really doesn't rock your boat, it has to now. You have to know about diggers, because that's important to your students. So you have to go and do a little bit of homework. You don't have to be an expert on it, because actually you want the kids to be. You can model that you don't know everything, but you've got to know enough. You've got to be a little bit interested and be creative with it. The other thing that we see a lot is, imaginative play is one of the highest forms of play our children can be involved in. It is the most beneficial for their brains, and we want fantasy and magic and imagination to last for children as long as possible, right? We want Santa Claus to be real forever if we could, because it's so wonderful to have magic in our lives. So a part of our role as a teacher is to foster that magic and to be part of it. I had a teacher last week who you can see it brewing in the classroom, and I said, now's time for a magical creature to arrive in your room one night, and you don't know anything about this magical creature and why they're there, and to start promoting wonderment and curiosity through magic, I think is something that takes a special teacher to do that.
Absolutely. So I'm also wondering about skills such as questioning for our teachers.
Yeah, so one of the things that we are really good at as teachers is asking lots of questions. We ask lots of questions, and the research shows that we actually ask quite low-level closed questions, and we're really good at answering them too.
Yes, within 1 second.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you cotton onto this as a student, you know that you can sit there long enough and not give an answer, and the teacher will give it for you, which means that you don't need to do the thinking and the teacher's done all the thinking. So what we try and advocate in a play-based setting are teachers doing far less questioning, being very strategic with the questions that they ask, and far more what we call positive descriptive feedback. So giving almost a commentary of what we're seeing, what we're noticing, and modeling thinking skills, modeling exploration, promoting language. So I wonder what would happen if you did this, right? And we call it a spray and walk away technique. So I would come in, I would be observing the play for a little bit if it's appropriate for me to be that close to the play, and I would say, oh, I can see there's a bit of a problem there. I wonder what would happen if, and then I say that not expecting an answer, and I step back out of the play and I watch, because the kids who hear that and are in the midst of where they, the zone of proximal development, that will generate that wondering, and suddenly they see the problem from a different angle, and you can almost see the cogs going, and they'll go, oh yeah, and away they go again, and you've just given them a nudge through that zone of proximal development into some success again. We also like to model, curiosity and creativity, but also helping children see different perspective as well. I can see your friend here is trying really hard to keep calm, because she really wants to be a part of this game. So teachers, recognizing emotion, teaching emotional literacy, again, all directed at those key competencies or social skills or soft skills. We have to be able to acknowledge that as well. And the research that I've completed recently, one of the things that we noticed that teachers don't do so well, and it's because we've got so much to think about, is actually noticing positive emotions in children. Just noticing and commenting on it, and then carrying on with the day. So a child running up to you, having just, done a flip off the back of something outside, and you can see they're beaming and they're so proud of themselves, being able to say, you look so happy right now, or you look ecstatic, tell me about it. Just in that moment, if we do that often, then children's emotional literacy grows from that. And we're not just noticing the emotions that we have to manage as well. So there's a lot to do as a teacher in play, and a lot of it is little bite-sized bits as we go through the day, which is why it takes a while to build up that kitty, if you like, that toolbox.
Yeah, it makes me wonder about the importance of teachers also verbalizing with great language, so that we're actually using the real words, and we're talking, I'm not going to say at a higher level, but we're using the real language and talking in communicating with clarity and precision, which I'm not doing very well right now. And for the teachers watching, Art Costa and Ben Akalik will be sharing the powerful questions session day 2. So first thing on day 2. So we'll get more into that. But yes, I think that providing the language has got to be a very important part of what their teachers are doing.
Absolutely. And this is where we can use curriculum specific language too. If we know our science curriculum well, we can introduce science specific language. The acceleration of your car down that ramp, was phenomenal, and use it with 5-year-olds. There's nothing better than hearing them use the word phenomenal back again, the more often it's used, and knowing, teaching acceleration, velocity, gradient, angle, gravity, all of these things can be taught in context, which means that they will start to use that back to you, which demonstrates their understanding of those concepts. So absolutely, it's again, this is all part of being an intentional teacher. You're going out into the play with the intent to grow language in play.
I love when children try and use those big words and they use them in an incorrect way. And I think that makes my heart sing, because one, they've had the ability to take the word in, two, that they're giving it a go, that responsible risk taking, and three, at some point they're going to understand it. And I often hear teachers say, yes, but if I use that word, they won't know what it means. And it doesn't matter. They didn't know what any word meant when you first started talking to them. So, sorry.
And we're modeling this in what they call first language learning conditions. Play is a first language learning condition. When we think about when children are first learning to speak, how are they learning? Often in play, either solitary play or with a caregiver, or as they get a little bit older in a play group and things like that, they're being immersed in language. This is just an extension of that when we get into a busy classroom. And so do we want them to be consolidating language with peers who only know the language they know, or do we want to keep gifting language to them that's relevant to the context that they're in?
Yes, so many layers and so much scaffolding just for our teachers to do as well, which is important. I want to go back to that point you were talking about before, Sarah, about making sure that we acknowledge the positive feelings, because I see this in even just in instructional teaching. When a teacher is teaching reading and the child will say something and the teacher will say, "Are you sure that's right?" Or, "Do you want to look at that again?" And we only ever say that when they're wrong. Yeah. We never say that when they're right. And so they get to learn unconsciously that when a teacher questions you, it's because you're wrong.
Yeah. And we often, I notice this in play, where teachers will even ask, very closed questions, what are you doing? And I've seen the look on kids' faces when they look up and think, well, what do you think it looks like? They're not going to say, they don't say it, yes. You feel them thinking like, you stupid woman, what does this look like I'm doing? But also they sometimes look at teachers like, is this a test? There's a right answer here I have to give. I'm just going to work it out. And I think when we ask those sorts of questions, often because they've had that modeling, like the example you've given, it teaches kids to lie. They make something up because they know they've got to give an answer and let's hope it's the right one. Instead of, just if teachers use more commentary and noticing, it actually invites a conversation rather than it being a power relationship between I'm the teacher and I hold all the answers and I'm checking what I know. And so the art of having a genuine conversation in play is really important as a teacher.
And challenging, because I want to know, what are some of the tips that you have for teachers to allow them to be able to take that step back and allow students to have more student-led experiences, but also being able to ensure these educational outcomes? Yeah.
So one of the misunderstandings as well in a primary school or grade school for those overseas classroom is that, if we think of that toolbox, and the other analogy I like to give is a continuum. The messaging we hear around play is often free play, and how free play is really important. And it is important. There are different learning outcomes that come from free play. I grew up having free play on the weekend after school with my friends. There were certainly lots of things that I did, probably my mother would, oh, great. And I learned a lot from those things, probably things I, wouldn't repeat. But that's not the same kind of learning we're talking about when you're using play as a pedagogical tool, right? And so when we if we see it as a continuum, we've got free play at one end. If we come back from that a little bit, we have child-led, which is a way of leading play with adult support, right? So that how I described earlier, that zone of proximal development and things like that. We also have periods of focused learning, which is adult guided, fun, experimental play, but it's the adult has the sort of learning outcomes in mind and is leading it. And then we have at the very other extreme that sort of chalk and talk, teacher directed, very traditional model, right? And I sort of see that continuum as a bell curve, because there are times when we really need highly structured teacher directed moments in school, a fire drill, an earthquake, a tsunami. You don't want the children to go, oh, I don't feel like coming with you outside for an evacuation. I'm going to lead this and I want to go over here. You don't have time for that. Adult in charge, keeping you safe, let's go. Likewise, free play can happen, the end of a term or a semester, everyone's tired, we've got everything done, let's just, relax a little bit, let's see what the kids get up to, and we're all too tired to think, right? Very ends of the extreme. But for the most part, we need to be in the middle. So it's knowing, when we come back to the toolkit, it's knowing which teaching strategies work for which educational outcomes. If I want my children to learn to read, we know from all the research that explicit instruction of reading is the tool for that job. The same as counting. You don't see a lot of kids practicing their times tables in play. Times tables is something that generally we have to learn by rote. We hope it's going to be fun and exciting as much as possible, but end of the day, you either know it or you don't, right? So there are the tools for that. What we talk about with teachers is, rather than an either or, it's around finding the balance. You're not going to get a pure play day all day, because there are things that as a teacher you have to ensure happen for your students, like learning to read, right? But equally, you're not going to have a all day explicit instruction timetable, because that's equally inappropriate for children as well. So it's finding the balance. Now, how that looks for teachers can be different depending on the school and the context. Where we've seen it work really well is where a school is well resourced. So there's lots of things for children to play with, lots of rich resources like loose parts. So it promotes creativity and innovation. That there are good expectations in place related to behaviour, how children use the space, how they treat each other and so on. That's all been taught, all that good best practice stuff as a teacher. Once those foundations are in place, then a teacher can start practicing what we call a rhythm of knowing when to be out in the play with students and supporting them, knowing when to pull kids in for an explicit group, spending a developmentally appropriate amount of time in a group with children sitting, and then moving back out into the play and doing this rhythm of in and out as the day goes on. There's also time that you have to come together as a class and have, a class meeting, class get together time, reinforce expectations, celebration, and so on. There's also timetables where you've got school assembly, you've got singing, you've got a visitor coming in, it's never clear cut, but it's fitting it in as much as possible, really to understand that we want to support children to develop independent thinking, creativity, flexible thinking, problem solving. To do those skills, they need to be left to lead their learning, to learn how to read, to develop their phonemic awareness, their writing skills, how to hold a pencil properly, their counting and so on. They need more explicit support. So knowing how to balance those two is really important. Knowing when to step back and when to be in the play is if you have a tendency as a teacher to ask lots of questions, to talk too much, to get too involved, then you have to practice the art of stepping back and zipping your mouth, really. And we often say to teachers, find a chair in the room and sit on it and watch and spend time watching and practice feeling uncomfortable with not having to be everywhere every moment of the time, and learn about your students by watching them, and then slowly, strategically think about where you are going to be best needed in the play, because not every child needs you in play all the time.
I think as teachers, we've got hooked on being a first responder, that we like feeling needed, we like feeling wanted perhaps, and we think we have to rescue because we're a first responder, right? It's like, oh, they're stuck, I have to rescue them. And that's the number one thing I see when I go in and do model lessons in a classroom, is that I purposely give children things that are hard and difficult, and the kids are squirming and it's difficult, and I see all the behaviors that come out to avoid the work, which is what I want to see, so I can then explicitly talk about it. But I see teachers just jumping in and rescuing. Come and sit back down in your chair. Oh, here's how you do it. Would you like me to do it for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I say to teachers, you've done all the thinking. You're a qualified professional. You don't need to do the thinking now. If you're doing the thinking, your students aren't. And we want them to be the active participants in this, not you. So, where you're having, I've seen teachers who'll say, I don't know, for example, resourcing play. I found all this stuff, but I don't know what they'll do with it. It's like, well, you don't have to know what they'll do with it. That's for them to decide. Just put it out and see what they do. But they feel like they've got to guide them or show them, this is how you do this. No, let them explore and do the thinking. They've got to do the hard work, not you as the teacher. You're there ready to be a support and a guide, but you don't do the thinking.
As Kath Murdoch says, the wonderful Kath Murdoch says, they need to do the heavy lifting.
Absolutely.
Get them to do it. And my favorite book title is Never Work Harder Than Your Students. And I just love that title because it's like, we do all the work and they just sit around and watch us. Because we need to switch those roles.
Yeah, and I think too, there's an acceptance that we need our students to be independent thinkers. We want them to be independent as they mature. They'll never get that chance if everyone's doing the thinking for them. They'll just wait to be told what to do.
So I think you've made a really important point that you need to have that balance, because what I hear a lot is, particularly in that year 4, 5, they've done so much play and they still can't do this, 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 and this. So play is not an excuse not to meet those educational outcomes. We still need to ensure that we have that balance and the 3 R's are there, so that when they go to that next class and that next teacher, and if it is more formal, that they're ready for that.
Yeah, I think that raises a couple of interesting questions around that. Absolutely, I agree. When we see a well-functioning play environment, the teacher is equipped and capable of teaching literacy and numeracy as well as teaching through play. And so one of my first questions when I hear of children coming through without good literacy and numeracy foundational skills is, it's not play's fault. Let's look at the instruction in literacy and numeracy, and what do they receive in those areas that makes them, perhaps struggling in those areas later on. I will say, though, that where there are schools who are delaying the teaching of literacy and numeracy to align with what we know about the neuroscience around the brain and the development of the brain, they might be saying, well, look, we do literacy and numeracy instruction, but we're not going to necessarily try and get them to a level that has been chosen as all 6-year-olds must reach, because we know not all 6-year-olds are the same. Then what we see is later on, we're seeing these disparities coming through. And so we're seeing year 3, 4 in particular, where schools have taken a softer approach to literacy development, that our year 3, 4 teachers are now sort of starting to say, oh, this is not what we're used to getting. We're used to getting children who are here, and now they're here. But those children, while they might be there, they've actually had a solid foundation in other skills that we can't measure so easily. And they might be your quite creative thinkers. They might be independent. They might be good problem solvers. They can probably socially play in a very pro-social way and know how to manage arguments and things like that. So there's lots of other things that have happened. And we can't necessarily use literacy and numeracy as a measure of success for junior school. It reminds me of a study it was sort of a subsidiary study or outcomes from a very large piece of research done on play in Northern Ireland. It's one of the largest research pieces done. I think that 900 children were involved, and they had sort of a spin-off of findings that came from it. And what they did is they had decided that they would run two groups. One was a control group, one was the experimental group. In that experimental group, those children didn't receive guided reading for the first 2 years at all. It was purely play. And they followed those children through in comparison to the ones that had, business as usual. When the first cohort of those kids got to 10, the children that had play were 6 months behind the children who didn't have play and had that guided reading early in their reading levels. But the second cohort that came through were at or above their counterparts. And one of the reasons that they gave for that was that it wasn't the children, it was that when these children who hadn't had the first 2 years of instruction met their year 3 teacher in that first round, that year 3 teacher was not prepared for emergent readers. And so the second cohort that came through, they were ready for emergent readers, they knew what to do, and these kids took off with their reading. So sometimes I think we have to be careful around, have them ready for year 3, year 4, ready for year 5, year 6, and say, well, actually, are the teachers ready for this cohort that's coming through? And do they have the skills to teach to the students in front of them? Because we know that play gives children an enormous array of skills. And if they are coming in low anyway in literacy and in that and that capital that they have from home and from early experiences, then actually they need more play, more language for it all just to click in and away it goes. We know that they catch up, typically developing children catch up no matter where they start with their learning.
I love that reframe of how we actually see that, because I think that is very, very true. As my children went through a Rudolf Steiner school, and so I played for those first 2 years, and, they were, one of them was a non-reader at 8 and was a chapter book reader at 8.5. And the foundations were in place. And one of the things that blew my mind is that never once did my children ever bring home an instructional reading book. So that, I was taught you have to read every day, and and I'm like,
we know there's no difference in early reading or later reading in terms of the neuroscience around that. That's really clear. Obviously, there are children who have specific learning difficulties that need extra support, but typically developing kids, it doesn't matter when they start, it matters of the quality of the instruction once they're ready and engaged for it. So, again, I talked all about the oral language benefits of play. For children who are coming in with low language levels, that immersion in language, the first language learning conditions, the connection to that is really the foundations. That's the literacy that they're getting at school to start with, and it builds on that.
And I also love that reframe of it's the teacher readiness for the cohort that's coming in, because even if you're not play-based learning in your school right now, many of the students coming into your classrooms have had 2 years right now of, maybe not being at school, maybe interrupted education. And so it's our job to meet the learners where they're at and then take them to that next level. So
yeah, and one of the things that I really love, and I remember seeing a meme or something about it, and it just really struck me, where it said something about, but they're going to be behind, and it said, behind what? We have to start challenging that. Behind what? Because it's not a race. We're not all going to reach the finish line at the same time, and it's really important that we run our own race. And I think when teachers, we've got to be careful that we don't have that sort of rhetoric driving our expectations of our kids, when actually we have to meet the learner where they're at and know which incremental steps next we support them on, rather than this big marathon we've got to try and make them win. Every child has to win. So behind what is quite a nice way of answering that question.
Beautiful way. Sarah, I think we could carry on, but we're running out of time, and this is fascinating. And I think if people are just wanting to delve into play, you've given them some great things to think about and consider. And if they're already in play, some steps that they can level themselves up to make sure that they are meeting the needs of the students, and also being flexible in the way that they do what they do in their classroom. So thank you so much. I think we've just opened the lid just a tiny bit, just a tiny bit, so much more. But Sarah, the question we're asking everybody, because we're all about lifelong learning here, is what are you reading, what are you watching, or what are you listening to that's totally inspiring you right now?
I think probably, to sound a bit cliche-ish, I absolutely love Sir Ken Robinson. He is probably he's the reason why we decided to homeschool our children, my husband and I, watching his talks. And probably the book I love the most of his is The Element, because for me, it summarizes our role as adults is to help children know what their element is. And I recently gave a talk where I challenged the teachers to look at their children in their classroom and think, I've got budding artists in here, I've got mechanics, I've got doctors, I've got politicians, gymnasts. Who are these people? And the element that's sitting in here is my responsibility to help foster. And often schools are assassins of talent rather than creators and supporters of talent. And I think Ken Robinson has a wonderful way of promoting this view of children, and particularly those who perhaps don't necessarily fit the standard mold of school life. So I'd encourage anyone to read that, or anything of his, but The Element in particular.
Absolutely. It's a great book. And Erica Tawani is the last speaker today on day one of our summit. And although you don't have to be watching them in order, but she's written an amazing book called Becoming Einstein's Teacher. So basically she's talking about that. What if Einstein had been in your classroom? What would you have done? And so finding that passion and that spirit. So wonderful. Sarah, again, thank you so much for being willing to share some of your wisdom and your knowledge with us to, really try and inspire us to think a little differently and to maybe not bend the rules, but question the rules around what we've always done, and is that the way that we really want to be as educators? Because I think play is a very, very important pedagogical approach for our learners right now. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks so much, Karen.
And teachers, go over to the Facebook page. Let's have a conversation. Do you use play in your classroom? Are you considering it? Let's have a conversation, and I'll see you there.